I really want to thank all of you for being here. And I want to thank UCCS because I think what's been successful here at UCCS is that we've had leadership on these issues from the ground up and also from the top down. And that's a dynamite combination if you can do both of those things. So thank you. So my great pleasure at this moment is to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. We have two great keynote speakers that will be back in this room. And the first is Dr. Brenda Allen, our colleague from the University of Colorado, Denver. She assumed the position of Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion, which I kind of like that inclusion. You know, I have inclusiveness, and I'm sort of envious of that inclusion. Sounds might have to move in that direction. And she's been in that position since last summer, but that's nowhere near the beginning of the story in terms of her work on diversity and inclusion at University of Colorado, Denver, and prior to that at the University of Colorado at Boulder. You have a nice bio of her in your program, and one of the things that you'll notice is she's won all these awards where she's the first recipient of an annual award for XYZ. You can read those for yourself. And I'm pretty sure that means that people looked around and they had to create an award because they were so impressed with Brenda. And now it's going to continue into the future. I'm pretty sure that must be what that is about. She's the author of Diversity Matters. It's in its second edition, a really important book that deals with issues of privilege and intersectionality. She's a longtime friend of our campus. I could have everybody who's a friend of Brenda raise their hands, but that might be too overwhelming. And she's a cherished collaborator with others, and now I'm really delighted that she's in the Chief Diversity Officer position in Denver. Is great support for me and within the system. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brenda J. Allen.
Good morning. I drove almost over 2 hours to get here, so I would really like a more hearty welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Key, for the wonderful introduction, and to my wonderful scholar, colleague, associate, Pam. And I'm so pleased that if we had to lose my friend and colleague Mary, it is to this fabulous campus. So I'm so pleased to be here this morning to talk with you just a little bit about communicating difference matters at UCCS. And I offer these comments as well for our colleagues who are visiting from the surrounding community, because these issues in terms of communicating difference matter in all kinds of institutions, and I trust that you will find something from it. Now, I will share with you some recommendations in terms of the comments that I'm going to offer, but I invite you, as I am sharing some background information and sharing some rationale for, basically the title is the premise of the talk, Communicating Difference Matters. Communicating difference matters. There are different matters we need to be aware of, and the notion of communicating difference is something that matters. So that's actually the point of the talk, and as I share with you, I'm going to move through talking about what do I mean by communicating, how do I find difference, and what are the matters we ought to be aware of in terms of, in particular, thinking about the wonderful theme of this conference. And as I said, I'm assigning you, in case you weren't clear, I am assigning you that as I talk, that you discern, kind of the so what's. What does this point have to do with how I, and why I've come here this morning, right, might improve diversity and inclusiveness? That actually doesn't roll as nicely as diversity and inclusion. Don't you agree? Diversity and inclusiveness, diversity and inclusion. So anyway, but don't laugh because I'm still giving you the assignment, right? So is everybody ready for the assignment? Yes. Huh? Yes. Oh, yes, ma'am, I like that. So because it really is important, I think that's a key part of inclusion, is recognizing that for almost any topic that I share with whatever audience, I help them understand they already know something. They already have something to offer. They also can be responsible for what they know and understand. So to begin, some years ago when I was actually teaching at the University of Colorado, Boulder, I was in my office and a non-traditional student in my neck of the woods, that means an older student, named, let's say her name was Carol, because that was her name. Carol came to my office, and Carol was a self-defined Latina student who was a returning student, and she and I had begun to establish a really positive relationship. I really enjoyed her company. I appreciated that she had returned to school. Sometimes I find that those students who've come back to school seem to be more hungry for learning, and they certainly have a lot to contribute in terms of their life experiences. At any rate, Carol walked into my office, and there was a flyer on my desk that was written in Spanish. And I looked at her and I said, "Carol, what does this say?" And she looked at me and she said, "I don't know. I don't speak Spanish." And for me, that was one of those oops moments in terms of communicating across difference. Now, to Carol's credit and to my advantage, she went on to explain that in her family, and she was second or third generation, so they'd lived in Colorado for quite a while, her family lineage, that in her family, they intentionally taught their children not to speak Spanish because they were concerned in terms of the stigma that would occur for them. So this was knowledge for me. This was something that I did not know. And this marked a moment of my own awareness that there's sometimes things I don't know about persons from other cultures or other identities. And this story, I think, is a nice way to open up our conversation about the issue of communicating difference matters. And I'm going to come back to that story a few times during the talk. Have any of you ever had those kind of oops moments of communicating across differences? If you didn't raise your hand, yeah, I have to kind of wonder. Maybe, no, to be inclusive, perhaps it's because you just haven't been aware. And one of the things that, one of the recommendations I make immediately in terms of communicating difference is to heighten your awareness of how these issues work. At any rate, I did want to talk with you a bit about this notion of communicating, because it's something we talk about so often, it's something we do so often, but I want to be sure you understand what I mean when I say communicating difference. So a very basic definition of communicating is sharing meaning. So communicating is ways that human beings share meaning with one another. And those ways of sharing meaning can be either explicit or implicit. And both of those matter in terms of communicating across and actually within different categories. Communicating also is verbal and nonverbal. So that there again, it's really important to understand that certainly communicating has a lot to do with words and what we say, what we express, but it's also as much about how we say what we say. The intonation, our posture, our gestures, and all of those, verbal in terms of word choice, in terms of language, as well as how we use our bodies, our voice. Nonverbal also includes ways that we dress, our accessories, etc. All of those help to share meaning, that we infer or we imply something from one another. And I trust that as I share with you this kind of basic notion of communicating, I hope that you also can begin to anticipate how breaking down this notion of communicating becomes pivotal to thinking about how can we communicate more effectively and humanely across and within different social identity categories. Because, do you believe this statement? You cannot not communicate. You cannot not communicate. So that is to say, if I just walked into a classroom and didn't say anything whatsoever, anyone else who's in that classroom would be inferring something about me as I would about them, right? And so that's a type of community. There's some meaning making, some perception going on. And as we think about the different, even thinking about how your campus defines diversity, how your campus defines striving to be more inclusive, then immediately you can see anything from hair color, hairstyle, dress, skin color, facial features, and then when one begins to talk, if there's an accent, all of those, we infer meaning. And we have been taught in terms of how to perceive and infer those meanings. So that, interesting to me is thinking about verbal communication. What's the difference between jargon and slang? Jargon, slang, right? Which would you be more, which would you prefer to be accused of speaking, particularly in a business environment? Jargon or slang? Jargon. And yet each of them really just means specialized terms for a speaking community, right? So again, I hope you're beginning to see some of the implications for thinking a little bit more about what do we even mean by communicating. And as you can imagine, I could do a whole talk on this, and I'd have you practice, do some role playing, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm feeling a little challenged just talking with you because I really prefer interactive. So maybe next year or some other time I can actually do a workshop keynote. How's that? So other aspects of communicating, formal and informal, and how we define formal and what we perceive as informal vary according to different groups. Communication is always mediated somehow, whether it is through our actual voice, whether it is through the variety of technologies that we use, print media, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, communicating is always power-laden. So that interaction between Carol and me was laden with power dynamics in terms of I was the professor, she was the student. We both probably were around the same age. We both were women. We both women of color. So all those kinds of aspects of our identity potentially influenced or certainly were related to ways that we communicated. And even, I suspect, the way that she immediately helped me understand why she didn't understand Spanish, I believe, was because of our relationship of teacher-student. And again, this is something that I could go into much more detail, but due to time I won't. I will come back to the notion of power. So what do I mean by difference? I actually prefer to use the word difference rather than diversity, because diversity, for one, is really, the connotation is kind of controversial sometimes. People often don't even explain what they mean by it. I like the word difference because when you think about difference, and you think about every other human being, and you think about your identities, various identities, there's no one in the world that is exactly the same as you. There's no one in the world that is exactly different than you. So what difference does for me is it implies a continuum, so similar to different in terms of social identity. And by social identity, I mean one's sense of oneself or another person that's based on group identity. So social identity is group-oriented. It's having membership in that group, and that membership, by the way, can be perceived by you and or others. So I'll begin to move into the particular categories of difference that are especially salient in higher education and other settings. So if you think, for example, about many people who are multiracial often talk, and here we come back to the notion of communication and cues. They often say that people will see them when they first meet them and they'll say something like, "What are you?" And what do you think provokes that question? What are you? For one, it almost is, well, what difference does that make? And I think the question itself substantiates the notion that these issues of identity do matter to a certain extent to us, right? So we're looking for this cue somehow. If we thought we knew, we wouldn't say anything, but guess what? We would still be interacting based on what we think we know about those identity categories. So it's membership perceived by others and or self, and it's meaningful to self and or others. So for instance, I've given a couple examples in terms of thinking about race. Let's think about, for a moment, about gender as a category of social identity. That and oftentimes when I do an exercise in which I invite people to share, if you could just identify yourself in 3 social identity categories, what would they be? And if no one could see you and they would know only the 3 categories that you gave them, interestingly enough, most often the people the identity categories that people say they'd want people to know are the non-dominant categories, so that very rarely do men say, I'm a man. Would they say man, Protestant, and veteran, for example, right? That women are the ones more likely to choose one of those as their 3, because we have been socialized to be aware, to be conscious of that aspect of our identity. So social identity is meaning to self and or to others. Identifiable, so we have various labels for these aspects of social identity. Learned, and this is a key point that is really important to understand, because we often treat these aspects of social identity as if they are real and universal and they've always been the same. So certainly the notion of gender, the idea of male-female, most of you would say, well, that's real and that's based on something. And yet gender is how we are taught to enact certain aspects of identity, and that varies widely. It varies within cultures, it varies across time, etc. So we learn and we teach one another how to enact these various social identity categories. And by the way, I know that many of you already know a lot of these points that I'm making, and I always rather err on the side of reminding you of something you already know. And in particular, I have learned that sometimes I'm reminded of something that I know at a very important moment when I need to be reminded. So I really don't want to seem at all patronizing, but rather I'd rather err on the side of repeating something you know than leaving out something that may be crucial to you understand what I'm sharing today. So it's learned and assigned. So it's a boy, it's a girl. You are, so I've been, in terms of my race, on my birth certificate there's an N for Nubian queen. Thank you very much. N for Negro, and within our community we called ourselves colored. This was in the 1950s and 60s. Then James Brown came out with the song, you all know, the Godfather of Soul. James Brown said, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. So suddenly it was okay for us to call each other black, when black really used to be one of the worst things we could call one another within our in-group because of colorism and because we had internalized hating ourselves in terms of skin color. But again, this is the notion of communicating, right? So I hope you're with me in terms of the examples and following in terms of the ways we communicate difference. So these labels are assigned and they vary across time. If you think about whatever your particular racial identity or ethnic identity is, especially any of you who are baby boomers like I am, you're probably aware of how even those designations have changed considerably across time. So you've heard that and you already know, you have part of your UCCS Diversity Strategic Plan 2007, which I understand has now been folded into your most recent campus strategic plan. Actually, it's very clear in terms of what you all mean by diversity and by the social identity categories. So notice these have a wide variety. What's important for you to understand in terms of how I'm framing this notion of difference and diversity is to understand that everybody right? Every one of us has a race, class, gender, sexuality, ability status, nationality, religious affiliation, etc. You with me? And so, in terms of thinking about communicating difference effectively and humanely, it's really important while you simultaneously are aware of and are addressing, right, the significance of inequities, the significance of discrimination, the significance of bias, the significance of social justice, that it's very important to invite everyone to think about themselves as gendered, raced, classed, etc. And I'll talk a bit more about this in terms of thinking about communicating difference matters. So this is a very nice schema that also Key alluded to in terms of really recognizing the complexities of identities. That, yes, I am an African-American woman. I prefer saying black, and I gave you a little sense of why. Historically, for me, that makes sense for how I call myself, because it was a moment in history that was particularly salient in a positive way. I'm also female. I said baby boomer. Pretty decent in terms of ability status, mental and physical abilities. Straight, but not narrow. You'd like that if you hadn't heard it before, huh? Yeah. So, depending on the context, one or any of these will feel more foregrounded for me as I interact with other people, even as one or more of them may be foregrounded for the persons with whom I'm interacting. This is also an important point in terms of thinking about communicating difference, is as you're working with whatever your roles may be in your organizations, that you don't homogenize, that you don't look at a person and it's strictly this is a woman, right? Or this is a black person, or this is a Latino, or this is someone from an indigenous community. But understand that these other aspects of identity also are operating. Moreover, even within these categories, and I'll say a bit more about that as well, there are particular differences and nuances. So even if again, I'll give the example of my race of being black, there are so many shades of blackness, and not just even in terms, not in terms of color, but in terms of how any of us who self-identify as black have been socialized to enact that aspect of our race. And I bet for any of you, again, regardless of whatever your race is, whatever your gender, in any of the categories I just showed you, you are aware of how you, and especially if you start paying more attention to it, right? You're aware of how you've been taught to enact that aspect of your identity. So difference matters. That's difference, and important to understand intersectionality, and important to understand heterogeneity within homogeneous groups. Important to understand that every one of us embodies those aspects of identity. So difference matters, you already know all of this. In terms of population trends, projections, globalization, persistent inequities, and yet a potential for positive change, even though there are numerous challenges that we must address. And the Chancellor spoke to some of those earlier today. Those challenges include, for one, when it comes to many aspects of social identity, and I'll land on race just for one moment, race and gender. Some people want to say, we're done with that, right? We have a black president, we have a female, we have women in numerous positions in society, so we're pretty much set. So people want to deny. They also tend to engage in false dichotomies. It's either or. Either you are black or you're white, right? In terms of thinking about race, for example. Either you are gay or straight, right? So we tend to polarize or make dichotomies of identities that are challenges to communicating effectively and humanely across and within differences. We also tend, as I've said earlier, to simplify the categories, to just say, okay, we have X number of students who are Asian or of Asian descent. And my goodness, part of my learning and growth is just the wide variety within all communities of color, quite frankly, but part of my education has been in particular thinking about Asian communities. And especially with that, because many of the statistics about the aggregate, right, indicate things like model minority, higher grades, higher performing, wealthier, and yet there are groups within Asian groups that are poor, that are, that have particular needs that may be passed over because of these assumptions. So we simplify categories. We tend to focus more on the other. I said a bit about that already in terms of recognizing. If I say to you we're going to talk about gender, we're going to talk about what it means to be man. We're going to talk about what it means to be woman. And we're going to talk with each other about how we're aware of being scripted in those gender categories. Difference is a problem. Diversity is a problem we've got to solve, as opposed to difference is something to celebrate. And we also heard it earlier, diversity as a separate issue that comes up in many different ways in university and other organizations. And I'll come back to that in a moment after I talk for a bit about, in addition to how difference matters in general and the general challenges and problems that occur around difference, is why higher ed is especially significant. Because for one, higher education and educational entities in general are primary sources of constructing persons' identities. We learn a lot about who we are and who others are in educational settings. And in particular, for college-age students, traditional college-age students, developmentally, this is a pivotal part of their lives. And so for those of us in higher ed and those of us in other aspects of education, to understand this is almost a sacred role that we have, where we have the potential to either maintain the status quo and continue in terms of indoctrinating students subtly or blatantly, unintentionally or intentionally, in terms of dominant belief systems, in terms of scripts about who we versus they are, right, along these different categories. So we're a primary source of constructing identities. More and more, especially for our students, higher ed is a place where we encounter differences, right? Where we have students coming from high school settings or other communities that they've not experienced interacting with persons from other racial, ethnic, LGBTQ groups. In fact, I understand that in terms of sexual orientation, that many persons discover their sexuality when they get to college. So these are really important issues to recognize and understand. Moreover, we're a phenomenal context for change, which is part of the work that we're trying to do. And yet we have particular challenges that, again, we've alluded to somewhat earlier. For one, it's the idea that whose work is it to do diversity work? When I first came to CU Boulder, I had a wonderful department chair. Do you know John Bowers? John Bowers told me, they're going to ask you to be on every damn, excuse my French, committee. And he said, but you tell them I said no. And what I didn't understand at that time was just how true that was. So I was invited to represent African Americans, to represent people of color, to represent women of color. And when I came to that campus, they hired one other African American assistant professor, thereby tripling the number of black women on that campus. So as you can imagine, I was pretty popular, especially once they met me, and I started working with them, right? So I jest, and yet this is a really important issue to understand. And an issue to understand as you strive to diversify your faculty and staff is to understand that those faculty of color, those staff of color who are already here are probably paying, serving disproportionately to many of their colleagues. That's just a reality that occurs across many settings. Moreover, if they are like me, and in my experience, many faculty of color are and staff of color are, we feel obligated. We've actually been taught from within our community that we should be helping. So you put that together, and it's just an interesting and important issue that comes back to we tend to relegate diversity responsibilities to these other groups, to particular individuals or groups, to specialized units, right? That's ethnic studies work, or that's, women's studies work. And by the way, because I know I'm going to run out of time, I want you, again, I've given you an assignment. And by the way, has anyone inferred a lesson you can take in terms of communicating difference matters from what I've said so far? Raise your hand. Yes, ma'am, in the pink. Stand up, speak up. What have you learned? Please. Who are you? Hi. Welcome. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. I would say check out my book. I would say check out my, and this, by the way, this is not a brag thing. That book is truly a collaboration that arose, as you'll see from the first story in the book, of my experiences with white students at CU Boulder, where I realized, excellent. Oh, yeah, please, definitely. Colleagues, you see, check in, okay? Thank you very much. Excellent. So I'm so pleased to hear that you drew that from what I shared so far, and I only wish I had time, not only for me to hear what others have inferred, but for you to share with one another, because that's how learning is so phenomenal. And how I learn more and how I realize, maybe something else I might address in my talks and so forth. So thank you so much. Another challenge is polarizing diversity and quality. That many times faculty members, for instance, in terms of curriculum, will say, well, we can't put diversity in because then we can't really cover what we're supposed to. Or people who are concerned. I actually had another person of color once send me an email saying that she was looking for research assistants and would love if I could recommend a qualified student of color. And it just felt to me that, that just had a ring to it that I think she herself may not have been aware of. And that's what happens a lot of times in terms of this communicating by, about, and across differences, is our own biases bubble up. And by the way, a very good resource, if you haven't seen it, is the implicit association test that I'll have my website up at the end of the talk, differencematters.info, but I have a wealth, by the way, of information and resources and exercises, and one of them is that implicit associations test, which actually will pop pictures at you and you have to quickly respond, and it actually measures that you're biased one way or another. So when I did the one about race, I learned that I'm biased toward white people and away from black people. Not surprising at all for me because I've been so indoctrinated from when I was a kid along those lines. And that doesn't make me racist. It doesn't make me a bad person. It makes me someone who's seeking to better understand how biases operate in my life. So when I'm inviting you to do the same, then I can have some empathy, but I also can model for you how to do that. We also tend to perpetuate a variety of institutional isms. Institutional racism, sexism, elitism, classism in most institutions is huge, and we rarely look at ways that we are classist, right? Of routinely, for instance, selecting textbooks and not even checking to see how much they cost. It's just, I need to use this book, so students need to figure out how much it costs. Or using certain language and assuming that everyone understands what it means. It goes on and on. We tend to emphasize being tolerant instead of social justice. And for me, this notion of social justice is pivotal in terms of communicating difference matters. So I have some recommendations, a couple of which are readily seen in the diversity strategic plan. For one is the notion of engaging fully across those differences. And I know you already have some phenomenal programs that do that, but I'm inviting you who are part of this community to ensure that you are doing that, as well as perhaps initiating and generating new ideas, as well as those of you who are from other communities and other institutions to figure out how you might do that. And the notion of integrating lessons is really important. Also is the idea of starting with yourself. I'm continuing to learn and grow, and I love the process. You just have to be ready to be kind of disappointed in yourself. When you're honest, right? When you're honest about, wow, when this person talks, and the way you often can do it is when you realize what you've assumed about somebody, right? And then you say, wow, she's really articulate, or wow, he's whatever. Then that's a moment when you are doing what I call TUI, thinking under the influence of dominant ideology. So it's really important to do that kind of work. And again, you all have resources here to do that. The other thing is something that was also spoken to earlier, and you're doing it already, making diversity central to your planning, decision-making, and development, and the idea of not making it a separate kind of thing that somebody else does sometimes, right, but to integrate it. Moreover, diversity is everybody's business. And so this does a nice job of responding to the challenges that I mentioned earlier. So in conclusion, I could give you several other recommendations. I invite you to continue to reflect, especially as you move into your workshops and to our keynote and to the remainder of the day, to set your intention that you're going to leave with a variety, a list. In fact, can you commit to intending to leave with at least 3 specific actionable items as a result of being at this summit? Can you agree to that? I pledge on my honor, I will try to do my duty. That's my Girl Scout pledge, and to obey the Girl Scout laws. So I encourage you to do that. And I want to close with coming back to my conversation with Carol, because I think it's such a wonderful model of a dialogue. So for me, as that person who made a kind of faux pas in assuming because she was Latina that she could read Spanish, right? That was an oops moment for me that I was willing and readily acknowledged. I said, I'm so sorry, Carol, right? Instead of becoming defensive or trying to gloss over it. And Carol was right there with me to say, well, here's why. And I was right there to take that lesson and share it with others. So with that, that models a dialogue across differences that I encourage. So that means for any of the groups for which you are a member of the non-dominant group, one of the things we teach ourselves, and especially among African Americans, is, you know, I get tired of educating people. I've stopped saying that. I have stopped saying that. There once was a T-shirt that said, it's a black thing you wouldn't understand. And my partner said to me, hey, what if we started saying, it's a black thing, ask me about it, right? Or it's a black thing, let me tell you about it. So that, especially in these kinds of contexts, even though, you know, I want to qualify that slightly because I don't want it to end up being more like being expected to do all of the work, right? But particularly in some of these kind of one-on-ones, to have patience with one another across our differences. And in that way, I think we all can be much more effective and humane in terms of communicating difference matters. Thank you.